Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadowed corridors of imperial China, where the glint of a blade decides your fate forever. You're standing in a cramped, dimly lit room in Beijing circa 1750, watching as a young boy, maybe 12 years old, lies trembling on a wooden table. The air reeks of medicinal herbs and something else you can't quite place. Fear mixed with desperate hope. In moments, a single cut will transform this child from a peasant's son into a potential palace powerhouse, if he survives. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, about how some of history's most influential figures gain their power through unimaginable sacrifice. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. I'd love to hear where and when you started watching tonight, or perhaps what draws you to these forgotten corners of history. Now let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You watch as the knife specialist, that's what they called themselves, unwraps his instruments with practiced precision. This isn't some back-alley butcher. This is a professional castrator, one of perhaps a dozen men in all of Beijing licensed to perform this procedure. The boy's family has saved for years to afford this opportunity because becoming a eunuch isn't just mutilation, it's the only path from poverty to power for boys like him. The Qing dynasty employs thousands of eunuchs, and each position represents escape from a life of grinding rural poverty. The procedure itself is shockingly swift. You witness the castrator binding the boy's legs, applying a tourniquet, and in one decisive motion removing everything with a curved blade sharper than a razor. The screaming stops abruptly as shock sets in. Hot oil is immediately applied to cauterize the wound, followed by a plug made of pewter and wax inserted into the urethra to prevent it from sealing shut. The entire process takes less than 10 minutes, but those 10 minutes will define every remaining day of this child's existence. What happens next determines survival. You see the boy carried to a windowless recovery room where he'll lie motionless for 3 days. No water, no food. The theory being the bodily functions must cease entirely for proper healing. Historians still argue whether this abstinence actually helped healing or simply weeded out the weaker candidates through additional suffering. The mortality rate hovers around 30%, meaning 3 out of every 10 boys who undergo this procedure will die from infection, blood loss, or shock within the first week. If the boy survives day 3, you watch as the pewter plug is carefully removed. The first successful urination is celebrated like a rebirth, because in many ways it is. The child who entered this room no longer exists. What emerges is something entirely new in Chinese society, neither fully male nor female, existing in a liminal space that somehow grants access to the most powerful circles in the empire. The removed organs, meanwhile, are carefully preserved in a special jar, his precious, which will follow him throughout his career as proof of his sacrifice and qualification for palace service. You notice the families gathering outside, some weeping, others calculating. They've just traded their son's manhood for a chance at unimaginable wealth and influence. In a society where Confucian values emphasize male lineage and procreation above almost everything else, they've made their child a living violation of social order. Yet, paradoxically, this violation opens doors that remain forever locked to intact men. The newly made eunuch, if he survives, will never father children, never inherit land through traditional means, never participate in the ancestor worship that forms the backbone of Chinese spiritual life. Instead, he'll serve in the Forbidden City, potentially rising to influence policies affecting millions of people. The recovery process stretches for weeks. You observe the gradual healing, the careful monitoring of infections, the slow psychological adaptation to a transformed body. Many boys struggle with identity during this period. They're no longer who they were, but not yet who they'll become. Some develop deep resentment toward their families for making this choice. Others embrace it as their destiny. The physical pain eventually subsides, but the psychological implications ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves that will crash against every aspect of their future lives. As the boy finally stands and takes his first steps toward the palace, you realize you've witnessed more than a surgical procedure. You've seen the birth of a new class of person, one that will navigate Chinese imperial politics for the next several centuries, accumulating power through sacrifice, influence through loss, and strange forms of family through the abandonment of traditional kinship. The knife has fallen, the die is cast, and ahead lies a life unlike any other in human history. You follow the newly healed eunuch through the towering vermilion gates of the Forbidden City, watching as he cranes his neck upward at walls that seem to scrape the very heavens. The palace complex stretches before you like a golden ocean, nearly 180 acres of courtyards, gardens, and halls that house the most powerful man on earth and his thousands of servants. But as magnificent as this place appears, you quickly realize it's also the world's most beautiful prison, and your young eunuch has just received a life sentence. The first shock hits when you see the sleeping quarters. Hundreds of eunuchs are crammed into long, narrow dormitories that smell of unwashed bodies and medicinal herbs. Each man gets a space barely wider than his shoulders, marked by a thin straw mat and a small wooden chest containing his worldly possessions. The irony isn't lost on you. These men who serve in rooms lined with jade and gold sleep like livestock, packed together in conditions that would shame a rural farmhouse. Yet they consider themselves fortunate, because palace service means regular meals and protection from the chaos of the outside world. You watch the daily routine unfold with military precision. Before dawn, eunuchs rise and perform elaborate ablutions, not from vanity but from necessity. Serving the emperor requires absolute cleanliness. They dress in silk robes that mark their rank through subtle colour variations and embroidered symbols that outsiders can barely decipher. A eunuch's clothing tells his entire story: how long he's served, which department employs him, what level of imperial trust he's earned, and most importantly, how close he's allowed to approach the dragon throne. The work itself varies dramatically depending on assignment. Some eunuchs spend their days in the imperial kitchens, tasting every dish before it reaches the emperor's lips. A job that sounds pleasant until you realize they're human poison detectors, expected to die if necessary to protect their master. Others maintain the vast libraries, copying ancient texts with brushstrokes so perfect they rival printed characters. The most trusted eunuchs handle the emperor's personal effects, his clothing, his writing materials, his private correspondence, his most intimate secrets. But you discover the strangest aspect of palace life isn't the work, it's the artificial family structures that emerge. Since eunuchs can't father children, they create elaborate pseudo-kinship networks among themselves. Older eunuchs adopt younger ones, not legally but emotionally, creating chains of loyalty and mentorship that span decades. These fathers and sons share resources, protect each other from palace intrigue, and provide the emotional support that traditional families offer. Historians still argue whether these relationships sometimes became romantic, given the unique circumstances of men isolated from normal sexual and family life. The palace's geography reinforces their isolation. You notice that eunuchs live in a parallel city within the city, with their own quarters, their own dining halls, even their own temples where they pray for absolution from the sin of self-mutilation. They can see the imperial family's living spaces, but cannot truly inhabit them. They serve in the emperor's bedchamber, but can never experience the intimacy they facilitate. They handle imperial children, but will never hold their own. It's a life of eternal proximity to ultimate power combined with absolute exclusion from life's most basic experiences. The psychological toll becomes evident as you observe longer. Many eunuchs develop obsessive behaviours around the emperor's comfort, finding purpose in anticipating his every need. Others retreat into scholarly pursuits, becoming experts in poetry, philosophy, or palace history. Some channel their energies into accumulating wealth and influence, using their unique position to broker deals and gather information. But underneath all these adaptations, you sense a profound loneliness that no amount of silk or gold can remedy. Food becomes a particular obsession for many palace eunuchs. Cut off from sexual pleasure and family joy, they often pour their frustrated desires into elaborate culinary pursuits. You watch them debate the merits of different cooking techniques with the passion that other men reserve for love affairs. The palace kitchens buzz with eunuch gossip about new recipes, seasonal ingredients, and the emperor's changing tastes. For men denied so many pleasures, taste becomes a permissible indulgence they pursue with desperate intensity. The most successful eunuchs learn to navigate palace politics like master chess players, understanding that their survival depends on reading subtle cues and avoiding factional conflicts. They develop an almost supernatural ability to sense mood changes in their superiors, to disappear when convenient, and to appear with exactly the right service at the perfect moment. This hypervigilance becomes second nature, but it also means they can never truly relax, even in sleep. As night falls over the Forbidden City, you watch eunuchs retreating to their cramped quarters, some reading by candlelight, others whispering conversations that help pass the lonely hours. Tomorrow will bring another day of service in paradise, another day of living inches away from ultimate luxury while remaining forever outside its true embrace. The golden prison gleams under moonlight, beautiful and terrible, home to thousands of men who traded their manhood for a chance to serve power itself. You witness something extraordinary as you follow your eunuch through his first year of palace service. The gradual realization that castration, rather than ending his ambitions, has actually unleashed them. In the labyrinthine hierarchy of imperial China, eunuchs occupy a unique position that allows them to climb higher than most intact men ever dream possible. The very mutilation that society views as shameful becomes their greatest political asset, because unlike other courtiers, they pose no dynastic threat to the emperor's bloodline. The palace hierarchy unfolds before you like a complex board game where eunuchs hold surprisingly powerful pieces. At the bottom you see newly arrived eunuchs sweeping courtyards and carrying chamber pots, but even these lowly positions offer something remarkable: direct access to imperial spaces forbidden to outside officials. A eunuch emptying waste buckets hears conversations that could topple kingdoms. A eunuch polishing furniture observes the emperor's private moods and personal habits. Information is the currency of palace life, and eunuchs mint it daily through their invisible presence. You watch as ambitious eunuchs learn to leverage their unique advantages. Unlike traditional court officials who return home each evening to wives and children, eunuchs live entirely within the palace ecosystem. They're available 24 hours a day, ready to serve at any moment, and this constant availability gradually makes them indispensable. The emperor begins relying on them for tasks requiring absolute discretion: secret communications with concubines, private meetings with foreign ambassadors, confidential financial arrangements that bypass traditional bureaucratic channels. The most successful eunuchs you observe develop what you might call emotional intelligence on steroids. Denied traditional masculine roles, they channel their energies into reading people with almost psychic accuracy. They learn to anticipate needs, manipulate moods, and provide exactly the right combination of service and flattery that powerful people crave. A skilled eunuch becomes like a human mood ring, reflecting back whatever emotional tone his superiors require while carefully planting seeds of his own agenda. You're amazed to discover that some eunuchs rise to positions that would make provincial governors weep with envy. The chief eunuch of the inner palace wields influence comparable to a prime minister, controlling access to the emperor and managing the complex logistics of imperial daily life. These men command their own bureaucracies, oversee vast budgets, and make decisions affecting millions of subjects. Their castration, intended to diminish them, instead becomes proof of their total loyalty. They can accumulate enormous power because they can never use it to found rival dynasties. The promotion system you witness is both merit-based and utterly ruthless. Eunuchs advance by proving their usefulness while simultaneously demonstrating absolute submission. You see them competing through elaborate displays of service. One eunuch might master calligraphy to better serve as the emperor's secretary. Another might become expert in herbal medicine to manage the imperial health. A third might develop networks of informants to provide political intelligence. Each skill becomes a rung on an invisible ladder leading toward ultimate influence. But you also observe the dark side of this climbing process. Palace eunuchs develop a culture of intense rivalry masked by theatrical cooperation. They smile and bow to each other during formal ceremonies, then spend evenings plotting each other's downfall through whispered accusations and carefully planted rumours. The emperor, often young and inexperienced, becomes the prize in an elaborate game where eunuchs compete for his favour through increasingly sophisticated manipulation techniques. Some eunuchs you follow choose the scholarly path to advancement, becoming indispensable through their knowledge rather than their cunning. They memorize thousands of classical texts, master multiple languages, and develop expertise in subjects ranging from astronomy to military strategy. These intellectual eunuchs often become the emperor's tutors and advisors, shaping imperial policy through careful education rather than direct influence. Historians still argue whether these scholarly eunuchs wielded more or less power than their politically minded counterparts, but their influence on Chinese culture was undeniably profound. You notice that successful eunuchs develop a peculiar form of charisma. They learn to project authority without threatening masculinity, to command respect while maintaining submissive postures, to accumulate wealth while appearing selflessly devoted to service. It's a complex performance that requires constant calibration, and the most skilled practitioners make it look effortless. They glide through palace corridors radiating quiet confidence, secure in the knowledge that their sacrifice has purchased them access to power that intact men can only dream of possessing. The highest-ranking eunuchs you encounter live in luxury that rivals imperial family members. They maintain private apartments decorated with priceless artifacts, employ their own staffs of junior eunuchs, and dine on delicacies that common people never see. Yet this wealth comes with invisible chains. Every comfort depends on continued imperial favour. Every possession could vanish overnight if they fall from grace. They've climbed to heights that dizzy ordinary mortals, but they can never forget that their elevation rests entirely on the foundation of their mutilation and submission. You descend into the shadowy underworld of eunuch society, discovering networks that operate like ancient China's most sophisticated criminal organizations. Behind the silk curtains and golden facades of palace service, eunuchs have created intricate webs of loyalty, corruption, and mutual protection that would make modern, organized crime families envious. These aren't just workplace friendships. They're blood brotherhoods forged through shared suffering and maintained through codes of honor more binding than family ties. The initiation into these eunuch networks begins immediately after recovery from castration. You watch as senior eunuchs approach newly arrived boys, offering protection, guidance, and most importantly, identity within a system that has stripped away everything they once were. These mentorship relationships quickly evolve into something resembling mafia families, complete with godfathers, lieutenants, and foot soldiers all bound together by their common sacrifice and mutual dependence on the imperial system. Each network develops its own specialty and territory within the vast palace complex. You observe the kitchen brotherhood, eunuchs who control food procurement and preparation, using their position to skim profits from imperial banquets and sell information about who dines with whom. The treasury clan manages imperial finances, creating elaborate kickback schemes with merchants and contractors who supply the palace. The The Information Guild specializes in gathering and selling secrets, maintaining networks of spies throughout the empire who report on everything from provincial rebellions to romantic scandals among nobility. The corruption you witness is breathtaking in its sophistication. Eunuchs develop elaborate systems for converting their palace access into personal wealth. They sell appointments to lower positions, take percentages from merchants seeking imperial contracts, and broker meetings between outside officials and imperial family members. Some eunuchs become wealthy enough to maintain private estates outside Beijing, complete with gardens, libraries, and staffs of servants who treat them like feudal lords despite their castrated status. You discover that eunuch networks extend far beyond palace walls, creating tentacles that reach into every corner of Chinese society. Provincial governors curry favour with powerful eunuchs, knowing that a positive word whispered in the emperor's ear can mean the difference between promotion and exile. Merchant families pay tribute to eunuch networks, understanding that palace connections open trade opportunities worth fortunes. Even Buddhist and Taoist temples maintain relationships with eunuch brotherhoods, recognizing their influence over imperial religious policy. The most successful networks you observe operate with military-like discipline and organization. They maintain detailed records of debts and favors, create elaborate ranking systems among members, and enforce their own justice through methods ranging from social ostracism to physical violence. Senior eunuchs in these organizations command respect that rivals imperial officials, and their word becomes law within their spheres of influence. These castrated men, supposedly diminished by their sacrifice, have instead created parallel power structures that challenge traditional authority. But you also witness the brutal consequences of betrayal within these networks. Eunuchs who violate brotherhood codes face punishments that make their original castration seem merciful. Some are slowly poisoned with substances that cause agonizing deaths over months. Others are framed for crimes against the imperial family, leading to executions that involve their entire adopted families. The bonds that protect members also become chains that can strangle those who try to break free. Some eunuch networks focus on cultural rather than financial influence, creating artistic and intellectual societies that shape Chinese literature, painting, and philosophy. You see eunuch patrons supporting poets and scholars, commissioning works of art that reflect their unique perspectives, and preserving classical knowledge through private libraries that rival imperial collections. These cultural mafias wield soft power that outlasts political influence, leaving marks on Chinese civilization that persist for centuries. The most fascinating networks you encounter are those that operate across dynastic boundaries. When emperors die and new rulers ascend, political officials often face purges and executions, but eunuch networks frequently survive by quickly adapting to new masters. They've developed techniques for reading political winds and switching allegiances with perfect timing, maintaining their power structures even as the faces on the dragon throne change. Historians still argue whether this adaptability represents pragmatic survival or profound betrayal of their imperial service oath. You observe how eunuch networks create their own forms of justice and social services that government doesn't provide. They maintain funds for supporting disabled members, arrange elaborate funeral ceremonies that honor their unique sacrifice, and provide protection for eunuchs who fall from imperial favor. In a society that views them as aberrations, they've built communities that offer acceptance, purpose, and belonging that they can't find anywhere else. The most chilling aspect you discover is how these networks sometimes manipulate imperial succession itself. Powerful eunuch brotherhoods work behind the scenes to influence which princes receive favoritism, which concubines gain access to the emperor, and which advisors shape policy decisions. They're playing a game where the stakes are control of the world's most populous empire, and their castration, rather than disqualifying them, makes them the perfect puppet masters, invisible and seemingly harmless while pulling strings that move kingdoms. You slip behind the silk curtains into the emperor's most private chambers, where eunuchs orchestrate intimate dramas that would make Hollywood screenwriters blush. The imperial bedchamber isn't just a place of romance. It's the nerve center of dynastic politics, where eunuchs manage hundreds of concubines, orchestrate imperial pregnancies, and literally hold the future of China in their mutilated hands. What you witness here reveals how castrated men became the ultimate guardians of imperial sexuality, trusted with secrets that could topple dynasties. The sheer logistics are staggering. You watch as eunuchs manage the emperor's rotation through potentially thousands of concubines, maintaining detailed records of each encounter, like military campaign logs. They track menstrual cycles, monitor pregnancies, and document every intimate detail with bureaucratic precision that would impress modern fertility clinics. The head eunuch of the bedchamber wields a ledger more powerful than most government documents. It determines which bloodlines survive and which fade into history. You observe the elaborate protocols surrounding imperial intimacy. When the emperor desires companionship, eunuchs present him with jade tablets bearing the names of available concubines. His selection triggers a complex choreography involving dozens of eunuchs who prepare the chosen woman through ritual baths, costume selection, and strategic timing to maximize chances of conception. Every aspect of imperial sexuality is managed, monitored, and manipulated by men who can never participate in what they facilitate. The psychological dynamics fascinate and horrify you. Eunuchs develop intense emotional relationships with concubines they can never possess sexually. They become confidants, advisors, and protectors to women trapped in golden cages similar to their own. Some eunuchs form deep friendships with imperial women that last decades, sharing secrets and sorrows while maintaining the fiction of their sexless status. Others develop obsessive fixations that border on the pathological, living vicariously through the romantic lives they orchestrate but can never experience. You discover that eunuchs often know more about female anatomy and sexuality than the emperor himself. They study pregnancy symptoms with medical precision, understand the subtle signs of conception, and develop expertise in aphrodisiacs and contraceptives that would impress modern gynecologists. This knowledge makes them invaluable to concubines seeking to conceive imperial heirs or avoid unwanted pregnancies. The irony is profound. Castrated men become the empire's foremost experts on fertility and reproduction. The power games you witness are breathtakingly complex. Eunuchs can effectively control imperial succession by manipulating access to the emperor's bed. They decide which concubines receive opportunities to conceive, influence the emperor's preferences through subtle suggestions, and sometimes orchestrate pregnancies or prevent them through carefully timed interventions. The future of the world's most populous nation literally depends on decisions made by men who sacrifice their own reproductive capacity to serve imperial reproduction. You observe eunuchs developing elaborate systems for managing imperial jealousy and romantic intrigue. They become expert diplomats, mediating conflicts between concubines, preventing poisoning attempts motivated by reproductive competition, and maintaining delicate balances that keep the emperor's attention distributed enough to prevent dangerous favoritism. Some eunuchs specialize in reading the subtle emotional cues that indicate when imperial affection is shifting, allowing them to protect vulnerable concubines or exploit changing dynamics. The medical aspects of eunuch service in bedchamber management reveal their unique value. They're trusted to examine pregnant concubines, verify virginity, and monitor the health of imperial women in ways that would be scandalous for intact men. Their castration gives them access to female bodies that no other men possess, making them indispensable medical intermediaries who bridge the gap between imperial women and male physicians who can never directly examine their patients. You're struck by how some eunuchs sublimate their own frustrated sexuality into almost parental relationships with imperial children. They become devoted nurses, tutors, and protectors to princes and princesses, channeling their denied paternal instincts into fierce loyalty toward children they can never claim as their own. These relationships sometimes become the most emotionally fulfilling aspects of eunuch life, offering them vicarious experiences of family love that their sacrifice has otherwise made impossible. The strangest dynamics you observe involve eunuchs who develop romantic fantasies about imperial women they serve. Unable to act on these feelings, they express them through elaborate gift-giving, poetry, and protective behaviours that blur the lines between service and courtship. Historians still argue whether some of these relationships involved physical intimacy despite the eunuch's castration, but the emotional intensity is undeniable even when sexual expression remains impossible. As you watch eunuchs retiring to their quarters after managing another evening of imperial intimacy, you realize they've created meaning from the most profound paradox imaginable. Men who sacrificed their own sexuality have become the ultimate guardians of imperial reproduction, finding purpose in facilitating the very experiences they can never share. They've transformed their greatest loss into their most essential service, becoming indispensable precisely because their mutilation makes them trustworthy with the Empire's most intimate secrets. You witness one of history's most poignant survival strategies as eunuchs create artificial families from the wreckage of their severed bloodlines. Unable to father children or continue their ancestral names, these castrated men develop elaborate adoption networks that mirror and sometimes surpass traditional family structures in their complexity and emotional intensity. What emerges is a shadow kinship system where mentorship becomes parenthood, loyalty replaces blood, and chosen bonds prove stronger than biological ties. The adoption process you observe begins almost immediately when new eunuchs enter palace service. Senior eunuchs scout incoming boys like talent recruiters, looking for intelligence, ambition, or simply the spark of survival that might make a worthy son. These aren't legal adoptions recognized by Confucian law. They're emotional contracts, sealed through elaborate ceremonies that eunuchs conduct in secret temple spaces within the Forbidden City. The adopting father takes complete responsibility for his chosen heir's training, advancement, and survival within the treacherous palace hierarchy. You watch as these artificial families develop their own traditions and rituals that substitute for the ancestor worship central to Chinese culture. Eunuch fathers commission portraits of their adoptive lineages, create family altars where they burn incense for living descendants, and establish inheritance customs that transfer wealth and influence across generations of castrated men. Some of these eunuch dynasties span centuries, creating continuity that outlasts many biological imperial bloodlines. The emotional dynamics you observe are intensely complex. Eunuch fathers pour all their frustrated paternal instincts into their chosen sons, often becoming more devoted and protective than biological parents. They sacrifice personal comfort to ensure their adoptees receive the best possible training and opportunities for advancement. The relationships combine elements of parent-child bonds, mentor-student dynamics, and business partnerships, all wrapped in the desperate need for belonging that defines eunuch existence. You discover that successful eunuch families develop their own specialized knowledge and skills that pass from generation to generation like trade secrets. The House of Wei might specialize in imperial medicine, with each generation learning herbal remedies and diagnostic techniques that make them indispensable to imperial health. The clan of Liu could focus on financial management, developing accounting systems and investment strategies that multiply palace wealth across decades. These specializations become family brands that ensure continued relevance and influence. Some eunuch families you encounter operate like medieval guilds, controlling specific aspects of palace operations through carefully managed succession planning. When a eunuch father approaches retirement or death, he gradually transfers his responsibilities, connections, and accumulated wealth to his chosen heir. The transition is choreographed with precision that rivals imperial succession ceremonies, complete with formal recognition from other eunuch families and ceremonial passing of symbolic objects that represent accumulated power and knowledge. The strangest families you observe are those that span multiple generations simultaneously. A powerful eunuch might adopt several sons of different ages, creating complex hierarchies where older brothers mentor younger brothers, while all remain subordinate to their father. These extended eunuch families sometimes include dozens of members spread across different palace departments, creating networks of mutual support that function like corporations with emotional bonds replacing legal contracts. You witness heart-wrenching scenes of eunuch fathers on their deathbeds, surrounded by their chosen families who provide the comfort and continuity that biological children offer in traditional households. These deathbed scenes often include elaborate will readings where accumulated wealth, secret knowledge, and political connections are distributed among heirs who will carry forward the family's influence and honor. The dying eunuch achieves a form of immortality through his chosen successors, ensuring his sacrifice continues serving purposes beyond his individual existence. Some eunuch families develop elaborate genealogies that trace their lineages back through multiple imperial dynasties, creating fictional histories that provide psychological anchoring for men cut off from their biological roots. They commission family chronicles, maintain ancestral tablets, and celebrate founding anniversaries that commemorate the first father who established their particular lineage. These manufactured traditions become as sacred to eunuch families as biological ancestry is to traditional Chinese households. You observe how eunuch families sometimes compete with each other like rival clans, developing feuds that span generations and creating alliance networks that reshape palace politics. The House of Zhang might align with the clan of Chen against the family of Wang in struggles for imperial favour that play out over decades. These artificial kinship rivalries add layers of complexity to palace intrigue that outsiders rarely comprehend but that dominate the daily lives of imperial eunuchs. The most successful eunuch families you encounter are those that create emotional legacies extending beyond palace walls. They establish private schools, fund charitable works, and support artistic endeavours that bear their chosen family names. Some eunuch dynasties become patrons of literature, philosophy, or religious movements, ensuring their influence persists even after the imperial system that created them has crumbled. Historians still argue whether these chosen families provided adequate psychological substitutes for biological kinship, but their emotional intensity and practical effectiveness are undeniable. As you observe these complex family dynamics, you realize that eunuchs have transformed their greatest loss into a unique form of social innovation, creating kinship structures that transcend biology and prove that family bonds can be chosen as well as inherited. You enter the palace medical quarters where the true horror of eunuch existence reveals itself through the daily management of mutilated bodies that never fully heal. The castration that creates eunuchs is only the beginning of a lifetime medical nightmare, involving infections, hormonal chaos, and psychological torment that no amount of imperial luxury can remedy. What you witness here exposes the brutal physical reality behind the political power and palace influence these men achieve. The immediate post-castration complications you observe are staggering in their variety and severity. Many eunuchs develop chronic urinary problems because the healing process often creates scar tissue that restricts normal function. You watch palace physicians performing regular procedures to reopen blocked urethras, operations so painful that eunuchs often require restraints and opium to endure them. Some men need these interventions monthly for their entire lives, turning basic bodily functions into ongoing medical emergencies. The hormonal consequences of castration create a constellation of health issues that palace doctors struggle to understand or treat. You observe eunuchs developing what modern medicine would recognize as severe osteoporosis, their bones becoming so brittle that simple falls result in fractures that never properly heal. Their voices change in unpredictable ways. Some develop the high-pitched tones associated with castration, while others experience vocal instability that makes speaking painful or embarrassing. Many eunuchs suffer from what appears to be severe depression and mood swings, though palace physicians attribute these symptoms to spiritual rather than hormonal causes. The skin conditions you witness are particularly disturbing. Without normal hormone production, many eunuchs develop pale, almost translucent skin that bruises easily and heals slowly. They often appear decades older than their actual age, with facial features that become oddly childlike as they lose the masculine characteristics that would normally develop during puberty. Some grow excessive body hair in strange patterns, while others become completely hairless except for their heads. These physical changes mark them as obviously different from intact men, reinforcing their social isolation even when they achieve political power. You discover that eunuch medicine becomes a specialized field within palace healthcare, with physicians developing treatments specifically for castration-related ailments. They create hormone-balancing herbal remedies that sometimes help with mood disorders, develop surgical techniques for managing urinary complications, and establish dietary protocols designed to strengthen bones weakened by hormonal imbalance. Some of these medical innovations prove so effective that they are eventually adopted for treating similar conditions in intact patients. The psychological medicine you observe reveals the deep mental health crisis pervading eunuch communities. Palace physicians recognize that many eunuchs develop what they call melancholia of the severed, a condition involving persistent sadness, loss of appetite, and withdrawal from social interaction that sounds remarkably similar to what modern psychology would diagnose as complex trauma. Treatment involves combinations of herbal antidepressants, meditation practices borrowed from Buddhist traditions, and group therapy sessions where eunuchs share their experiences with others who understand their unique suffering. You witness the development of a black market medical economy within the palace, where eunuchs seek treatments that official physicians won't provide. Some eunuchs experiment with substances they believe might restore their lost masculinity, or at least improve their physical appearance. Others seek pain medications to manage chronic discomfort from their original surgery or subsequent complications. This underground medical trade creates additional risks for men already struggling with compromised health, but their desperation makes them willing to try almost anything for relief. The most heartbreaking medical reality you observe involves eunuchs' relationship with their own bodies. Many develop body dysmorphia that goes far beyond normal concerns about physical appearance. They become obsessed with hiding evidence of their castration, wearing elaborate clothing designed to disguise their altered anatomy and avoiding situations where their physical differences might become apparent. Some eunuchs never fully undress, even in private, because they can't bear to confront the visual reminder of their sacrifice. Historians still argue whether the medical knowledge developed for treating eunuchs contributed positively to Chinese medicine or represented a dark chapter best forgotten. Some scholars suggest that eunuch physicians developed sophisticated understanding of hormonal disorders centuries before Western medicine recognized these conditions. Others argue that the entire medical infrastructure supporting castration normalized a barbaric practice that should never have existed. You observe how some eunuchs become medical experts themselves, driven by necessity to understand their own conditions better than palace physicians. They study anatomy, experiment with treatments, and develop detailed knowledge of how castration affects different body systems. Some become informal doctors within eunuch communities, providing treatments and advice that help their fellow sufferers manage conditions that mainstream medicine can't address effectively. The strangest medical phenomenon you witness involves eunuchs who claim to experience phantom sensations from their removed organs. They describe pain, pleasure, or simple awareness in body parts that no longer exist, creating psychological torment that physicians can neither explain nor treat. Some eunuchs become convinced that their preserved organs, kept in jars throughout their careers, maintain supernatural connections to their bodies, leading to elaborate rituals designed to care for these relics as if they were still living tissue. As you leave the medical quarters, you realize that every political triumph, every moment of palace luxury, every demonstration of eunuch power occurs against a backdrop of constant physical and psychological pain that never fully subsides. These men have traded their body's integrity for social influence, but the medical consequences of that trade follow them like shadows until their final breath. You march alongside one of history's most paradoxical figures, the eunuch general, a castrated man leading armies of intact warriors into battles that will determine the fate of empires. The sight seems almost absurd at first. How can men stripped of their masculinity command the respect of soldiers whose very identity revolves around martial prowess? Yet as you witness these remarkable leaders in action, you discover that their perceived weakness becomes their greatest strategic advantage, allowing them to achieve military victories that traditional generals could never accomplish. The most famous eunuch general you encounter is Zheng He, the castrated Muslim who commanded the largest naval expeditions in human history. You stand on the deck of his treasure ship, a vessel so massive it dwarfs European caravels like whales beside minnows, watching as this soft-spoken eunuch coordinates fleets carrying 30,000 sailors across the Indian Ocean. His castration, rather than diminishing his authority, actually enhances it. Soldiers know he can never use military success to establish his own dynasty, making him the perfect instrument of imperial will without personal ambition threatening the throne. You observe how eunuch generals develop unique leadership styles that compensate for their physical limitations. Unable to rely on traditional masculine intimidation or physical prowess, they become masters of psychological warfare and strategic thinking. They study their enemies with scholarly intensity, developing battle plans that rely on intelligence, logistics, and careful preparation rather than brute force or personal charisma. Their castration forces them to become more clever, more careful, and ultimately more effective than generals who depend solely on conventional military virtues. The loyalty dynamics you witness are fascinating and complex. Soldiers initially view eunuch commanders with suspicion or even contempt, but this skepticism often transforms into fierce devotion once they experience the eunuch's competence. These castrated generals prove themselves through results rather than rhetoric, earning respect through victories rather than demanding it through traditional masculine displays. Some develop almost paternal relationships with their troops, channeling their frustrated, protective instincts into fierce care for soldiers under their command. You discover that eunuch generals possess significant advantages in military intelligence and espionage operations. Their castration makes them appear harmless to enemy women, allowing them to gather information through channels unavailable to intact male commanders. They can infiltrate harems, question female servants, and exploit romantic relationships between their spies and enemy personnel without arousing the sexual jealousy that might compromise normal male agents. Their networks often include other eunuchs serving in enemy courts, creating intelligence channels that span multiple kingdoms. The logistics of eunuch military leadership reveal their unique value to imperial strategy. Traditional generals with biological families have divided loyalties and personal interests that might conflict with imperial commands. Eunuch generals, cut off from family ties and unable to establish dynasties, demonstrate absolute loyalty to their imperial masters. They're willing to undertake suicide missions, adopt unpopular strategies, and make sacrifices that generals with wives and children might refuse. You observe eunuch generals developing innovative military technologies and tactics that reflect their scholarly backgrounds and careful thinking. They pioneer new siege techniques, develop improved supply systems, and create communication methods that give their forces significant advantages over enemies led by more traditional commanders. Their inability to rely on personal charisma forces them to excel through institutional innovation and systematic improvement. Some eunuch military leaders you encounter specialize in diplomatic warfare, using their unique status to negotiate with enemies in ways that intact generals cannot. Their castration makes them less threatening in diplomatic contexts, allowing them to approach enemy leaders without triggering the masculine competitive instincts that often sabotage military negotiations. They become masters of psychological manipulation, using their apparent weakness to lower enemy guard while gathering intelligence or sowing discord among opposing forces. The physical challenges of eunuch military leadership become apparent as you witness their campaigns. Many suffer from the health problems associated with castration: weak bones, poor circulation, and reduced physical stamina, that make long campaigns particularly difficult. Yet they compensate through careful planning, superior logistics, and delegation to subordinate commanders who handle the physical demands, while the eunuch provides strategic direction. You witness the strange phenomenon of eunuch generals who become legendary figures among their troops, despite their obvious physical limitations. They inspire loyalty through competence, fairness, and genuine care for soldier welfare rather than through traditional masculine leadership models. Some develop reputations for supernatural tactical brilliance that make soldiers believe their castration somehow enhanced their strategic thinking by removing distracting masculine impulses. The most successful eunuch generals you observe are those who openly acknowledge their limitations while emphasizing their compensating advantages. They admit they can't match traditional generals in physical combat or masculine charisma, but they demonstrate superior intelligence gathering, more careful planning, and absolute loyalty to imperial interests. This honest self-assessment often wins them more respect than false masculine posturing would achieve. Historians still argue whether eunuch generals were more or less effective than their intact counterparts, but the evidence suggests they brought unique advantages to military leadership that traditional commanders lacked. Their sacrificed masculinity became a strategic asset, proving that in the complex world of imperial warfare, perceived weakness could transform into devastating strength. You slip into the shadows with history's most effective intelligence operatives, discovering how eunuchs transformed their social invisibility into the ultimate espionage advantage. Their castration, which marks them as non-threatening and sexually irrelevant, allows them to penetrate social circles and gather secrets that would be impossible for intact men to access. What you witness reveals an intelligence network so sophisticated and far-reaching that it puts modern spy agencies to shame. The foundation of eunuch espionage lies in their unique ability to move between gendered spaces that normally remain segregated in Chinese society. You watch as eunuch agents gain access to women's quarters in noble households, attend ladies' tea ceremonies where political gossip flows freely, and serve in domestic roles that make them invisible to the powerful men whose secrets they're collecting. Their castration serves as a universal passport, allowing them entry to intimate spaces where the most sensitive information gets shared. You observe eunuch spy masters developing recruitment networks that span the entire empire, targeting other marginalized individuals who possess access but lack power. They recruit servants, concubines, junior officials, and even beggars, creating webs of informants who report everything from provincial rebellions to bedroom conversations between merchants and their wives. The eunuch intelligence system operates like a vast nervous system, with castrated men serving as the brain that processes information flowing from thousands of nerve endings throughout Chinese society. The information processing you witness is remarkably sophisticated. Eunuch intelligence chiefs maintain detailed files on every significant figure in the empire, tracking their relationships, financial dealings, sexual preferences, and political loyalties with bureaucratic precision that would impress modern databases. They cross-reference reports from multiple sources, verify claims through independent channels, and build comprehensive personality profiles that predict how targets will respond to different pressures or incentives. You discover that eunuch spies excel at psychological manipulation because their own traumatic experiences have made them experts at reading human vulnerability. They understand fear, shame, and desperate ambition from personal experience, allowing them to identify and exploit similar weaknesses in their targets. A eunuch agent might spend months befriending a lonely official's wife, gradually drawing out secrets about her husband's corruption or political affiliations that can later be used for blackmail or strategic advantage. The communication networks you observe are ingenious in their simplicity and effectiveness. Eunuch spies develop elaborate codes hidden within seemingly innocent palace communications. A request for additional lamp oil might actually report troop movements, while complaints about kitchen supplies could indicate shifts in provincial loyalty. They use the constant flow of supplies, personnel, and official correspondence flowing through the imperial system to hide intelligence reports in plain sight. You witness eunuch intelligence operations that span decades, with agents maintaining deep cover identities for their entire careers. Some eunuchs pose as religious monks, using temple networks to gather information about rural unrest and merchant activities. Others work as tutors or accountants in noble households, slowly building trust while documenting financial irregularities and political conversations that might prove useful to their imperial masters. The international scope of eunuch espionage amazes you as you discover networks extending far beyond Chinese borders. Eunuch spies work trade routes connecting China to Central Asia and Southeast Asia, gathering intelligence about foreign military capabilities, economic conditions, and political instability that might affect Chinese interests. Some eunuch agents spend years living in foreign countries, learning languages and customs while reporting back about potential threats or opportunities. You observe how eunuch intelligence services develop specialized techniques for different types of targets. They create honey trap operations using carefully trained female agents to compromise foreign diplomats or rebellious officials. They establish fake merchant enterprises that serve as covers for gathering economic intelligence, while actually turning profits that fund additional operations. Some eunuch spies become expert forgers, creating false documents that can destroy careers or start wars depending on imperial needs. The most chilling operations you witness involve eunuch agents who infiltrate religious and philosophical movements that might challenge imperial authority. They pose as sincere converts to Buddhist, Taoist, or Confucian schools, gradually working their way into leadership positions where they can influence doctrine, identify potential rebels, and manipulate spiritual movements to serve political purposes. Their castration often makes them appear more spiritually pure, helping them gain trust within religious communities. You discover that eunuch intelligence networks sometimes operate independently of official imperial policy, pursuing their own institutional interests and protecting eunuch power against threats from traditional officials or military commanders. They gather compromising information about potential enemies within the government itself, using blackmail and character assassination to eliminate rivals who might threaten eunuch influence or advocate for reducing castrated men's role in imperial administration. The psychological toll of espionage work becomes apparent as you observe veteran eunuch spies struggling with the constant deception and emotional manipulation their roles require. Many develop paranoid tendencies, trusting no one completely and viewing every relationship through the lens of potential exploitation. Some lose the ability to form genuine emotional connections, becoming hollow men who exist only to serve intelligence functions while their human souls slowly atrophy. Historians still argue whether eunuch intelligence operations strengthened or weakened imperial China by creating information advantages that helped emperors make better decisions while also fostering a culture of suspicion and paranoia that corroded social trust. What's undeniable is that these castrated men created intelligence capabilities that remained unmatched until the development of modern technological surveillance systems. You enter the incense-filled halls where eunuchs seek spiritual salvation for their mutilated bodies and fractured souls, discovering religious movements that transform castration from shame into sanctification. Cut off from traditional Confucian ancestor worship that requires intact male bloodlines, these men create alternative spiritual paths that reframe their sacrifice as divine calling rather than social punishment. What emerges as some of the most fascinating and disturbing religious phenomena in Chinese history? The most prominent eunuch spiritual movement you encounter centers around Buddhist monasteries that welcome castrated men as uniquely qualified for celibate religious life. Eunuch monks argue that their forced celibacy makes them ideal candidates for achieving enlightenment, claiming their physical sacrifice has eliminated the sexual desires that distract ordinary men from spiritual pursuits. You observe entire temples populated primarily by eunuch monks who've transformed their palace service into religious vocation, creating communities where their castration becomes evidence of spiritual advancement rather than social degradation. You discover eunuch cults that develop elaborate theological justifications for castration as a form of divine purification. These groups interpret their mutilation through Buddhist concepts of suffering leading to enlightenment, arguing that voluntary acceptance of their castrated state demonstrates the ultimate rejection of worldly attachment. Some eunuch religious leaders claim to receive visions and prophecies that specifically validate their sacrifice, creating belief systems where castration becomes a prerequisite for accessing higher spiritual truths. The strangest religious movement you witness involves eunuchs who worship their preserved organs as sacred relics possessing supernatural powers. They maintain elaborate shrines around the jars containing their severed parts, burning incense and offering prayers to what they believe are their disconnected sources of masculine energy. Some eunuch priests claim these preserved organs can grant fertility to women, predict the future, or provide protection against evil spirits. The rituals surrounding these bizarre relics combine elements of ancestor worship with fertility cults in ways that would horrify orthodox Confucian scholars. You observe eunuch religious communities developing their own versions of traditional Chinese festivals that acknowledge their unique spiritual status. They celebrate Purification Day to commemorate their castration as spiritual rebirth, create adoption ceremonies that formalize their artificial family structures through religious blessing, and establish sacrifice festivals where they honor eunuchs who died in imperial service. These invented traditions provide psychological anchoring for men cut off from normal cultural participation. Some eunuch spiritual movements you encounter adopt Taoist practices that emphasize internal energy cultivation and immortality seeking. Eunuch Taoist masters argue that their castration has redirected their sexual energy inward, allowing them to achieve spiritual states impossible for intact men. They develop meditation techniques specifically designed for castrated practitioners, claiming to transform their physical loss into metaphysical gain through careful cultivation of remaining life force. The most disturbing religious phenomenon you witness involves eunuch cults that practice ritual self-mutilation beyond their original castration. Members voluntarily undergo additional surgeries to remove fingers, toes, or other body parts as demonstrations of their commitment to spiritual purification through physical sacrifice. These extreme sects attract eunuchs who find their initial castration insufficient for achieving the psychological transformation they seek, leading to escalating forms of self-destruction disguised as religious devotion. You discover eunuch religious leaders who become powerful spiritual figures throughout Chinese society, attracting followers among intact men and women who view their sacrifice as evidence of supernatural dedication. These eunuch gurus establish temples, write religious texts, and develop philosophical schools that influence Chinese spiritual thought far beyond eunuch communities. Their castration, rather than disqualifying them from religious leadership, becomes proof of their transcendence of worldly concerns. Some eunuch spiritual movements focus on serving as intermediaries between the living and the dead, claiming their liminal status between male and female gives them special access to spiritual realms. Eunuch mediums conduct seances, interpret dreams, and provide spiritual counseling to people seeking connection with deceased relatives. Their castration is presented as evidence of their detachment from earthly concerns, making them ideal vessels for supernatural communication. The most sophisticated eunuch religious movement you encounter develops a complete theological system that reinterprets Chinese spiritual traditions through the lens of castration experience. These eunuch theologians argue that traditional masculinity represents spiritual immaturity, while their forced feminization through castration brings them closer to the yin principles that balance cosmic energy. They create elaborate metaphysical frameworks that position eunuchs as spiritually evolved beings who've transcended gender limitations that constrain ordinary humans. You witness eunuch religious communities providing psychological services that mainstream society can't offer. They create support groups where castrated men can share their trauma without judgment, develop therapeutic rituals that help members process their loss and find meaning in their sacrifice, and establish charitable works that serve other marginalized populations. These religious functions often prove more valuable than their stated spiritual purposes. Historians still argue whether eunuch religious movements represented genuine spiritual innovation or psychological defense mechanisms that helped traumatized men cope with their mutilation. Some scholars suggest these spiritual communities preserved important elements of Chinese mystical tradition that might otherwise have been lost, while others view them as tragic examples of how oppression can distort religious expression into unhealthy forms. The most haunting aspect you observe is how eunuch spiritual leaders often achieve genuine peace and even joy through their religious practices, finding in their mutilation a pathway to transcendence that transforms their greatest loss into their most precious spiritual asset. Their smiles, as they lead prayer services or counsel troubled followers, suggest that some forms of human resilience can transmute even the most devastating trauma into sources of wisdom and compassion. You enter the gilded counting houses and merchant networks where eunuchs have transformed their palace access into vast commercial empires that rival the wealth of princes. Their castration, intended to ensure loyal service through economic dependence, instead becomes the foundation for accumulating riches that dwarf the fortunes of intact men who must divide their resources among wives, children, and extended families. What you witness reveals how these supposedly powerless servants became some of the wealthiest individuals in imperial China. The foundation of eunuch wealth lies in their unparalleled access to imperial purchasing decisions. You observe eunuch procurement officials who control contracts worth millions of taels of silver, taking percentages from every transaction that supplies the Forbidden City with food, clothing, furniture, and luxury goods. A single banquet for foreign ambassadors might generate kickbacks that exceed a provincial governor's annual salary, and eunuchs organize dozens of such events annually. Their position at the nexus of imperial consumption creates revenue streams that flow like rivers of gold directly into their private coffers. You discover eunuch trading networks that extend throughout Asia, leveraging imperial diplomatic connections to establish commercial relationships in countries where Chinese merchants normally cannot operate. Eunuch traders accompany official embassies, using their diplomatic immunity to transport goods without paying customs duties or facing the restrictions that limit private merchants. Some eunuchs become wealthy by importing exotic spices from Southeast Asia, precious stones from Central Asia, or rare medicinal herbs from Tibet, selling these luxury items to wealthy Chinese customers at enormous markups. The most ingenious eunuch business model you encounter involves currency exchange and lending operations that exploit their access to imperial treasuries. Eunuch financiers develop relationships with provincial officials who need immediate cash to meet imperial tax demands, offering loans at interest rates that would make modern loan sharks blush. They also engage in currency speculation, using their advanced knowledge of imperial economic policies to profit from predictable fluctuations in silver prices or exchange rates between different regional currencies. You witness eunuch real estate empires that span multiple provinces, built through careful accumulation of properties purchased with palace profits. Since eunuchs cannot pass wealth to biological children, they invest in assets that generate perpetual income rather than planning for dynastic inheritance. Some eunuchs own hundreds of rental properties, vast agricultural estates, and commercial districts in major cities, creating passive income streams that continue generating wealth even when their palace influence wanes. The manufacturing operations controlled by eunuchs amaze you with their scale and sophistication. You observe eunuch industrialists who own silk production facilities, porcelain workshops, and metalworking operations that supply both imperial needs and private markets. Their palace connections give them first access to the finest raw materials and most skilled craftsmen, allowing them to produce luxury goods of quality that command premium prices throughout Asia. Some eunuch entrepreneurs you encounter develop what amount to early forms of banking and insurance services, using their networks to facilitate trade between distant regions while taking profits from currency conversion and risk management. Merchants traveling the Silk Road rely on eunuch financial services to transfer funds securely across thousands of miles, paying substantial fees for services that only palace-connected individuals can provide reliably. You discover eunuch monopolies that control entire industries through their imperial influence. The tea trade, silk production, porcelain manufacturing, and precious metal mining all feature eunuchs who've used their palace positions to gain exclusive access to the best suppliers, most skilled workers, and most profitable distribution channels. These monopolies generate wealth that accumulates across decades, creating fortunes that rival those of merchant princes and regional governors. The investment strategies employed by wealthy eunuchs reveal their unique long-term perspective. Unable to plan for biological heirs, they focus on building institutions and assets that can support their chosen families and ensure their legacies survive their deaths. You observe eunuchs establishing private schools, funding artistic projects, and creating charitable foundations that bear their names and continue their influence long after their palace careers end. Some eunuch financiers become shadow partners in legitimate merchant houses, providing capital and imperial connections in exchange for profit shares that remain carefully hidden from official scrutiny. These partnerships allow intact merchants to access palace contracts and imperial favour, while giving eunuchs commercial expertise and broader market access that multiplies their earning potential beyond what palace service alone provides. You witness the development of eunuch commercial codes and business practices that become models for later Chinese entrepreneurship. They pioneer accounting methods, develop contract templates, and establish business ethics that influence commercial culture throughout the empire. Their need to operate partially outside normal social structures forces them to innovate business practices that prove more efficient than traditional merchant methods. The most successful eunuch merchants you encounter are those who reinvest their profits in expanding their palace influence, creating virtuous cycles where commercial success generates political power that enables even greater commercial opportunities. They purchase additional positions for their protégés, fund imperial construction projects that require their ongoing management, and establish themselves as indispensable economic advisors whose commercial expertise becomes essential to imperial decision-making. Historians still argue whether eunuch commercial empires strengthened or corrupted imperial China by creating efficient economic networks, while also fostering corruption that diverted resources from public purposes to private gain. What's undeniable is that these castrated men developed some of the most sophisticated commercial operations in the pre-modern world, proving that their sacrifice of biological reproduction could generate forms of wealth that transcended traditional family-based economic structures. The irony is profound. Men castrated to ensure their economic dependence instead created financial independence that exceeded what most intact men could achieve, transforming their intended weakness into their greatest source of worldly power. You witness the blood flowing through palace courtyards as new dynasties attempt to cleanse themselves of eunuch influence through systematic extermination campaigns that make medieval purges look restrained. The very castration that once guaranteed eunuch loyalty becomes their death sentence when political winds shift, as incoming rulers view these powerful servants as living symbols of the previous dynasty's corruption and weakness. What unfolds before you are some of history's most brutal genocides, targeting men whose only crime was serving their masters too well. The pattern repeats with horrifying predictability each time dynasties change. You observe the Ming founder Hongwu Emperor ordering the execution of over 40,000 eunuchs in a single purge, convinced that their influence had corrupted the previous Yuan dynasty beyond redemption. The killings aren't quick or merciful. Eunuchs are tortured for information about hidden wealth, forced to reveal their networks and accomplices, then executed through methods designed to maximize terror among survivors. Their castration, which once made them appear harmless, now marks them as easy targets who cannot fight back effectively. You watch as entire eunuch families, the artificial kinship networks they've spent decades building but are systematically destroyed. When purge orders arrive, palace guards don't distinguish between powerful chief eunuchs and humble servants. Castration itself becomes the crime punishable by death. The adopted sons and grandsons who represent eunuch immortality attempts are slaughtered alongside their fathers, eliminating entire artificial bloodlines in single afternoons of coordinated violence. The psychological warfare employed during eunuch purges reveals the deep resentment intact men harbour toward their castrated competitors. You observe torturers who force eunuchs to watch their accumulated wealth being distributed to real men with wives and children, making the dying eunuchs witness the destruction of everything they sacrifice their masculinity to achieve. Some executioners specifically target the preserved organs that eunuchs keep as sacred relics, destroying these pathetic reminders of lost manhood while their owners are forced to watch. The most chilling aspect you witness is how thoroughly these purges attempt to erase eunuch influence from historical records. New dynasties order the destruction of documents detailing eunuch achievements, the defacement of monuments commemorating their service, and the execution of scribes and historians who might preserve positive memories of castrated officials. They're attempting to commit not just physical genocide, but cultural erasure, ensuring that future generations won't even know eunuchs once wielded significant power. You discover that some eunuch purges are motivated by sexual anxiety and masculine insecurity, rather than purely political concerns. New emperors, often young and inexperienced, view powerful eunuchs as unnatural threats to proper gender order who must be eliminated to restore masculine authority. The propaganda surrounding these massacres frequently emphasizes themes of restored virility and renewed masculine vigor, as if killing castrated men somehow enhances the sexual potency of intact males. The survival strategies you observe among eunuchs facing purges reveal their desperate creativity and tragic futility. Some attempt to disguise their castration through clothing and posture, hoping to pass as intact men until the killing frenzy subsides. Others flee to remote temples or foreign countries, abandoning their accumulated wealth and artificial families to save their lives. A few try bribing executioners or appealing to former lovers among imperial women, but these efforts usually only delay rather than prevent their deaths. You witness the phenomenon of eunuch hunts, where common people are encouraged to identify and kill suspected castrated men in exchange for rewards. These campaigns create atmosphere of terror, where any man who appears effeminate, speaks in a high voice, or lacks obvious masculine characteristics risks being accused of hidden castration and murdered by mobs. The purges expand beyond actual eunuchs to victimize anyone who doesn't conform to rigid masculine stereotypes. Some eunuch massacres you observe involve elaborate public spectacles designed to humiliate castrated men before killing them. They're forced to parade through streets wearing signs declaring their crimes, subjected to public mockery that focuses specifically on their sexual inadequacy, then executed in ways that emphasize their emasculation. These theatrical elements suggest the purges serve psychological functions beyond simple political necessity, allowing intact men to symbolically reassert their sexual superiority over their castrated competitors. The economic motivations underlying eunuch purges become apparent as you watch new dynasties seizing the vast wealth that castrated men accumulated during their careers. Since eunuchs often lack biological heirs to claim inheritance, their assets become available for redistribution to supporters of new regimes. Some purges are essentially elaborate robbery schemes disguised as political reform, using anti-eunuch sentiment to justify confiscating fortunes worth millions of taels of silver. You observe how eunuch purges sometimes backfire by eliminating institutional knowledge and administrative expertise that new dynasties desperately need. The men being slaughtered possessed decades of experience managing imperial logistics, understanding palace protocols, and maintaining diplomatic relationships that cannot easily be replaced. Some new emperors realize too late that they've destroyed the very administrative infrastructure they need to govern effectively. The few eunuchs who survive these purges do so by demonstrating their usefulness to new masters while completely abandoning loyalty to their former employers. You watch survivors publicly denouncing their dead colleagues, revealing hidden corruption schemes, and providing intelligence that helps new dynasties consolidate power. These collaborators purchase their lives through betrayal, transforming from loyal servants into pragmatic survivors who've learned that principle is a luxury castrated men cannot afford. Historians still argue whether periodic eunuch purges were necessary corrections that prevented castrated officials from accumulating dangerous levels of power, or genocidal campaigns motivated by sexual insecurity and greed that destroyed valuable human resources and administrative expertise. What's undeniable is that these massacres created cycles of terror that haunted eunuch communities for centuries, ensuring that even the most successful castrated men lived under the constant shadow of potential extermination. You enter the most profound chambers of eunuch existence, where the absence of sexual fulfillment and biological family creates emotional voids so deep they reshape human nature itself. Here, in the quiet moments between palace duties and political maneuvering, you witness the price these men pay for their power, a loneliness so complete it transforms love into obsession, friendship into desperate dependency, and the simple human need for connection into psychological torment that never fully heals. The romantic longings you observe are heartbreaking in their impossibility. You watch eunuchs developing passionate attachments to imperial concubines they can never possess, channeling their frustrated desires into elaborate gift-giving ceremonies and protective behaviors that blur the boundaries between service and courtship. Some eunuchs compose poetry for women they love from a distance, creating literary works of stunning beauty that express yearning for physical intimacy they can never experience. Their castration hasn't eliminated sexual desire, it's simply made that desire perpetually unfulfillable. You discover eunuchs who form intense emotional bonds with each other that substitute for the marriages they can never have. These relationships combine elements of romantic partnership, brotherly affection, and mutual survival pacts into connections deeper than most biological families achieve. Some eunuch couples share living spaces for decades, pooling resources and emotions while maintaining the fiction that their relationship is merely practical convenience rather than profound love between men who understand each other's unique suffering. The surrogate parenting you witness reveals how eunuchs channel their frustrated reproductive instincts into relationships with imperial children, servants, and their adopted sons with intensity that sometimes becomes unhealthy. A eunuch might develop obsessive protective feelings toward a young prince, hovering over the child with maternal devotion that makes biological parents uncomfortable. Others become controlling fathers to their chosen heirs, demanding absolute obedience and emotional submission that reflects their own desperate need for unconditional love. You observe how some eunuchs develop what can only be described as erotic relationships with power itself, finding in political influence and imperial favour the emotional and physical excitement they cannot access through normal sexual channels. They pursue advancement with the passionate intensity that other men reserve for a romantic conquest, experiencing genuine arousal from successful manipulation of palace politics or imperial decision-making. Their castration has redirected their libido towards domination and control, rather than eliminating it entirely. The most tragic figures you encounter are elderly eunuchs who've accumulated vast wealth and influence but faced death knowing they've never experienced genuine intimacy or created lasting human connections. You watch them in their final years, surrounded by servants and artificial family members who provide comfort but cannot fill the fundamental emptiness where authentic love should reside. Some become bitter and cruel, using their power to inflict suffering on others as revenge for their own emotional deprivation. You witness eunuchs developing elaborate fantasy lives that substitute for the relationships and experiences their castration has made impossible. Some create detailed imaginary romances with historical figures or fictional characters, spending hours in private reveries where they possess intact bodies and live normal lives with wives and children. Others construct alternate identities where their castration never occurred, maintaining these psychological escapes through careful ritual and disciplined imagination. The jealousy dynamics among eunuchs reveal how their shared suffering doesn't automatically create solidarity. You observe bitter rivalries between castrated men who compete for the emperor's attention, with the desperation of lovers fighting over an unfaithful partner. Their need for exclusive emotional connection sometimes makes them more possessive and vindictive than normal court rivals, leading to vendettas that span decades and destroy multiple lives through their intensity. Some eunuchs you encounter attempt to fill their emotional void through collecting beautiful objects, surrounding themselves with art, jewelry, and luxury goods that provide aesthetic pleasure as substitutes for physical and emotional satisfaction they cannot access. Their private chambers become museums of exquisite taste, filled with treasures that reflect their refined sensibilities while highlighting the emptiness of lives lived entirely through material accumulation rather than human connection. You discover eunuchs who seek spiritual transcendence as escape from their emotional isolation, throwing themselves into religious practices with the fervour of mystics seeking union with the divine. They hope that by perfecting their souls, they can transcend the bodily limitations that define their earthly existence, finding in religious ecstasy the fulfillment that human relationships cannot provide. Some achieve genuine spiritual breakthrough, while others simply exhaust themselves through futile attempts to pray away their fundamental loneliness. The most disturbing emotional pattern you observe involves eunuchs who become addicted to witnessing the romantic and sexual lives of others, living vicariously through the imperial couples they serve, while simultaneously resenting their exclusion from such experiences. They develop voyeuristic tendencies that make them expert observers of human intimacy, while remaining forever outside its embrace, accumulating detailed knowledge of love and sexuality that serves only to emphasize their own deprivation. Historians still argue whether the emotional damage caused by castration was an acceptable price for the administrative benefits eunuchs provided to imperial government, or whether the psychological cost was so severe that the entire system represented institutionalized cruelty that should never have been tolerated. What's undeniable is that these men lived lives of emotional extremity, that pushed human psychological adaptation to its limits. As you observe eunuchs in their most private moments, weeping alone in their chambers, staring at their reflection in bronze mirrors, or simply sitting in silence while contemplating lives defined by absence rather than presence, you realize that their greatest achievement may be their simple survival. They endured emotional deprivation that would destroy most people, finding ways to create meaning and even joy from the wreckage of their sacrificed humanity. You stand in the crumbling courtyards of the Forbidden City during the final decades of imperial China, watching as the last generation of eunuchs witnesses the collapse of the only world they've ever known. The year is 1911, the Qing dynasty totters on the verge of extinction, and these castrated servants who once wielded power over millions now face obsolescence as China modernizes around them. Their ancient sacrifice suddenly seems not just tragic but utterly pointless, as the imperial system that justified their mutilation prepares to vanish forever. The contrast between past and present devastates these aging men. You observe eunuchs in their 70s and 80s who remember when their word could elevate generals or topple provincial governors, now reduced to sweeping floors and tending gardens while revolutionary armies march toward Beijing. Some still maintain the elaborate courtesies and protocols that once defined their existence, bowing deeply to empty thrones and performing ceremonies for an emperor who's little more than a powerless child surrounded by foreign advisors and modern bureaucrats who view eunuch service as medieval superstition. The last chief eunuch you encounter, Li Lian Ying, represents both the pinnacle of eunuch achievement and its ultimate futility. You watch this man, who once controlled access to the Dowager Empress Cixi, accumulated wealth rivaling European industrialists, and influenced policies affecting hundreds of millions of people, now struggling to understand a world where telephones, railways, and republican ideals are making his kind of power obsolete. His vast knowledge of palace intrigue and imperial protocol has become as useless as expertise in medieval siege warfare. You witness the pathetic attempts of surviving eunuchs to adapt their skills to a modernizing world. Some try becoming servants in wealthy households, offering their legendary discretion and service expertise to merchant fabricants who hire them more as curiosities than functional employees. Others attempt to establish small businesses using their accumulated savings, but their isolation from normal society and lack of family connections makes commercial success nearly impossible. A few join Christian missions, hoping to find new purpose in foreign religion that offers redemption for their past service to what missionaries condemn as pagan idolatry. The younger eunuchs you observe face the most heartbreaking situations. Men in their 30s and 40s who sacrificed their manhood for imperial service only to watch the empire collapse before they could fully benefit from their sacrifice. They're trapped between two worlds, too castrated to fit into modern Chinese society that increasingly values Western masculine ideals, yet too young to die peacefully as relics of the ancient past. Some attempt to hide their condition and integrate into normal society, but their physical characteristics and lack of family connections make passing as intact men nearly impossible. The Republican government's policies toward eunuchs reveal the new regime's determination to erase every trace of imperial decadence. You observe officials implementing laws that prohibit castration, close eunuch training facilities, and ban castrated men from government service. These policies, intended as humanitarian reforms, effectively condemn surviving eunuchs to poverty and social exile, since they possess no skills relevant to modern employment and no family networks to provide support. Some former palace eunuchs you encounter become living museums, selling their memories and artifacts to foreign journalists and scholars fascinated by imperial China's exotic customs. They display their preserved organs like carnival curiosities, tell exaggerated stories of palace intrigue to Western audiences, who view them as remnants of Oriental mystique, and pose for photographs that reduce their complex lives to simple symbols of China's backward past. Their dignity dissolves into performance as they trade their remaining self-respect for survival money. The most tragic figures you observe are eunuchs who attempt suicide rather than face life outside the imperial system. Having defined themselves entirely through palace service, they cannot conceive of existence without emperors to serve, protocols to maintain, or hierarchies to navigate. Some poison themselves using medications they learn to prepare during their palace medical training, while others simply stop eating and drinking, dying slowly of despair, in rooms filled with imperial gifts that have become worthless overnight. You discover a few remarkable eunuchs who successfully reinvent themselves as the imperial system crumbles around them. Some become teachers, using their literacy and classical education to instruct children of wealthy families in traditional Chinese culture. Others find employment with foreign legations, serving diplomats who value their linguistic skills and cultural knowledge. A precious few become scholars and writers, documenting their experiences and preserving knowledge of imperial customs that would otherwise die with them. The international attention focused on China's last eunuchs reveals Western fascination with what they perceive as Oriental barbarity. You watch foreign photographers and reporters interviewing these men, treating them like exotic specimens rather than human beings who've suffered profound trauma. Their stories become entertainment for Western audiences who use eunuch experiences to confirm their assumptions about Asian backwardness and the civilizing mission of Western influence. Historians still argue whether the elimination of eunuch system represented humanitarian progress or cultural destruction that erased valuable administrative knowledge and social innovations that might have evolved into more humane forms. Some scholars suggest that eunuch communities preserved important elements of Chinese governance and culture that were lost when the imperial system collapsed, while others view their disappearance as overdue liberation from institutionalized cruelty. The final imperial eunuch, Sun Yaoting, dies in 1996, carrying with him the last direct memories of palace life under the Qing dynasty. You imagine his final moments, an ancient man whose castration occurred in another century dying in a China that would be completely unrecognizable to the emperors he once served. His death closes a chapter of human experience that spanned over 2,000 years, marking the end of one of history's strangest and most tragic social institutions. As you watch the last eunuchs disappearing into obscurity, their sacrifices forgotten and their contributions dismissed as relics of feudal oppression, you realize you've witnessed the conclusion of an extraordinary human experiment that revealed both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human adaptability. You walk through the empty halls of the Forbidden City today, where tourists snap photographs and tour guides recite sanitized histories, but the ghosts of 10,000 eunuchs still whisper in the shadows between vermilion pillars and golden dragons. Their presence lingers like incense smoke, invisible but unmistakable to those who know how to listen, for the echoes of lives lived in service to power so absolute it demanded the ultimate sacrifice. What remains of their legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the price of ambition, the nature of loyalty, and whether any cause justifies the systematic mutilation of human beings. The physical spaces you explore still bear subtle traces of eunuch existence that most visitors never notice. Hidden doorways they used to move unseen through imperial apartments, small chambers where they stored their preserved organs like sacred relics, sleeping quarters so cramped they suggest lives of voluntary imprisonment in exchange for proximity to power. The architecture itself tells their story. Passages designed for servants who pose no sexual threat. Rooms positioned to allow constant surveillance while maintaining the fiction of privacy. Courtyards where artificial families gathered to create meaning from shared suffering. The artifacts you discover in museum collections reveal a complexity of eunuch culture that defies simple categorization as either victimization or collaboration. Their poetry speaks of longing and loss with literary sophistication that rivals the greatest classical works. Their artwork displays aesthetic sensibilities refined through lives dedicated to beauty they could appreciate but never fully possess. Some Eunuch-authored philosophical texts explore questions of identity, purpose, and transcendence, with insights that only those who've sacrificed everything for an ideal could achieve. You realize that Eunuch legacy extends far beyond the individuals who lived and died in imperial service. Their administrative innovations influenced Chinese bureaucracy for centuries after the last dynasty fell. Their diplomatic techniques shaped international relations across Asia. Their artistic patronage preserved cultural traditions that might otherwise have vanished during periods of political chaos. The men who seemed most marginal to their society actually helped create institutions and customs that defined Chinese civilization itself. The scholarly debates surrounding Eunuch history reveal our own discomfort with moral ambiguity and historical complexity. Modern historians struggle to evaluate men who are simultaneously victims of systematic abuse and perpetrators of political oppression, who created beautiful art while serving autocratic regimes, who found dignity and meaning through accepting degradation that should never have been imposed. Their stories resist simple moral judgments because they expose contradictions inherent in all human societies that trade individual suffering for collective stability. The psychological questions raised by Eunuch existence continue haunting contemporary discussions about gender, power, and identity. These men lived as neither fully male nor female, occupying liminal spaces that challenged every assumption their society held about masculine authority and feminine submission. Their experiences anticipate modern conversations about gender fluidity, chosen identity, and the arbitrary nature of social categories that seem natural until someone transcends or violates their boundaries. You discover that Eunuch influence on Chinese culture persisted long after their political power disappeared. Traditional Chinese medicine incorporates techniques they developed for managing castration-related health problems. Classical literature includes themes and perspectives they contributed through their unique social position. Architectural principles reflect design innovations they pioneered for managing large households and complex hierarchies. Their fingerprints remain visible throughout Chinese civilization for those who know where to look. The international legacy of Chinese eunuchs extends into contemporary global discussions about human trafficking, child exploitation, and the ways societies create marginalized populations to serve privileged classes. Their stories provide historical context for understanding how cultures develop and maintain systems of institutionalized abuse, while convincing participants that their suffering serves noble purposes. The techniques of psychological manipulation, economic control, and social isolation used to manage eunuchs appear in modified forms throughout modern human rights violations. Historians still argue whether eunuch system represented an extreme example of normal historical exploitation or a unique form of social organization that created opportunities for advancement unavailable through conventional channels. Some scholars emphasize the cruelty and dehumanization inherent in castration-based service, while others highlight the genuine power and influence some eunuchs achieved despite their physical sacrifice. Both perspectives contain truth that defies simple resolution. The most haunting aspect of eunuch legacy lies in the questions their existence poses about human adaptability and the search for meaning under impossible circumstances. These men created lives of purpose, beauty, and even joy from situations that should have destroyed them completely. They found ways to love, create, and contribute to their society while carrying wounds that never fully healed. Their resilience challenges assumptions about what humans can endure while remaining recognizably human. As you stand in the Forbidden City at sunset, watching shadows lengthen across courtyards where eunuchs once hurried on imperial errands, you realize their story illuminates timeless tensions between individual dignity and social function, Personal sacrifice and collective benefit, the price of power and the cost of service. Their ghost whisper reminders that every civilization builds its achievements on foundations of human suffering that participants rationalize as necessary for greater good. The wind carries their voices across centuries, speaking in the high, soft tones that mark their sacrifice, telling stories of lives lived in service to ideals that transcended their individual existence while demanding everything they had to give. They remind us that history's most profound questions often emerge from its most marginalized voices, and that understanding the past requires confronting the uncomfortable truths about what humans will do to each other in pursuit of order, beauty, and power. In the gathering dusk, as the last tourists depart and silence reclaims the ancient stones, you feel the weight of their collective memory settling like a gentle hand on your shoulder. These men who traded their manhood for immortality have achieved a different kind of eternal life through the questions they force us to ask about ourselves, our societies, and the prices we're willing to pay for the things we claim to value most. Their sacrifice continues serving purposes they never intended, teaching lessons they never planned to leave, challenging assumptions they never questioned while they lived. Now the evening deepens around these sacred spaces where power and suffering intertwined for centuries, creating legacies that stretch far beyond the men who paid their ultimate price. The shadows grow longer, the whispers softer, and slowly, very slowly, the ancient stones begin to rest, carrying their secrets gently into the peaceful darkness that finally, mercifully, embraces all stories and all sorrows with the same tender, timeless silence that heals everything it touches